Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Tiki Bar. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Jaime Konzelman. She's a chief revenue officer. She's a speaker. She's an author. She's been an executive coach. Jaime, I'm really excited to talk to you today. Thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's going to be super fun.
Yeah, we ask everyone who comes to the Tiki Bar the same first question. What did you want to be when you were a kid?
Depended on the moment, right? I think if you asked me when I was hungry, I wanted to be a chef. If you asked me when I had my, ballerina shoes on, it was Broadway. Always had a passion for animals. So somewhere I was going to be a veterinarian and save the world's animals from extinction. I guess multi-passionate child.
I like that. Mix of science, mix of art, some
Yeah.
care in there, all good things to pull on. Now, what was your very first paying job that you ever had?
I was a babysitter, so I used to go and mother's helper, right? I would go door to door probably from about 9 years old, which maybe you wouldn't do today, and just ask people what they needed help with. So anything from helping a new mom fold laundry to cook dinner to caring for kids. But then the first like paying job, right? Hourly salary kind of thing. Hourly was Dunkin' Donuts. I used to
Oh,
ride
there you
my
go.
bike up to the Dunkin' Donuts, make the sandwiches, change the donuts out, and then go off to school, high school.
Were you sneaking a little coffee before high school or not yet?
Not yet. I actually didn't start coffee until I was almost 30, but now would not go a day without it pretty much.
I'm exactly the same. I never drank coffee, kind of judged it if I'm being honest. And then I worked at a place that had like baristas and all the nice things you hear about. And I was like, okay, I'm going to get all this.
You're like, this is delicious.
It's fantastic. And then I got hooked. Okay, so babysitting, working at Dunkin' Donuts. You eventually, I was reading your story, go to NC State with the goal of becoming a veterinarian. So you were like leaning into this veterinary thing at that point.
Yeah, so I graduated high school super young. I was 16, and I wanted to go to the furthest school away from home, right? A little bit of rebel soul that I could get parental blessing. I didn't know that I really wanted to be a veterinarian, but I knew that track would be very appealing to my parents, and I loved animals, and I figured I'd figure it out along the way. And they had a veterinary program that's not only one of the best in the country, but had professors who'd written, journal articles that I used to read in like my little reptile and exotic animal magazines. So it was kind of neat to go chase, these people when I was a child I thought were famous because they were scientists writing articles. So I went down there to learn from them all things zoology.
Love that. So you're reading scientific journals and graduating from high school at 16. How did you graduate from high school at 16? I barely made it to 18.
Well, I was pretty miserably socially, in full transparency, right? I was the kid who loved to read, but hadn't picked up basic social norms, right? So didn't really have a group of friends. Today, I guess maybe they would call it bullying. Back then, they used to just call it teasing. I mean, I used to eat my lunch in a bathroom stall, so in high school, so people wouldn't steal my lunch, right? And so I think my parents got tired of me coming home crying about how much I hated my life. And one of my sisters said, well, maybe if she went to college early, like she'd be more challenged academically and she could start to connect with people sort of in academia. So my parents supported early graduation. And I was the youngest of eight. So it worked out well because I think they were a little tired of the rebellious teenager stage and thought if I got to university, it would be a win-win for everybody.
Okay. And then, so you're on this veterinary track, you're going to college at a young age, presumably, you're kind of doing all the right things on paper. And something happened that took you off of that path and changed your direction. Can you take me through that part of the story?
Sure. And what, I'm going to clarify when you say doing all the right things, I had no business being in college with not only no emotional maturity, but also no study skills. I mean, school had never been hard for me. I think I read at like 3 and was writing and on a little Commodore 64, plugging away and doing my siblings' homework just because I had that hunger to, engage my brain. And so when I went to college, it was hard. I did not know how to study. I did not have the self-discipline of how to apply myself, and school had never been hard. And so I also didn't follow the curriculum. I took all of the classes that interest me and ended up taking some grad classes that were super fun, but also didn't count towards my curriculum. So I am 2.5 years into college. I think I'm close to graduating and everything sort of started falling apart, right? I'd followed the wrong curriculum. I didn't actually have an advisor because the advisor I chose was on sabbatical doing research in Tenerife off the coast of Australia. And so when I found out, by the way, all those fun classes that you've taken while they're higher level don't actually count towards your degree, and you've got maybe 2 to 3 years left. Had a big old fashioned 18-year-old temper tantrum and sort of just kind of let myself go into another direction, which was not really applying myself anymore and failing out of classes, and hadn't really thought through the fact that if I lost that academic scholarship, not only was I going to not have an ability to pay tuition anymore, but I was also going to lose my housing, right? Because I was an honors or scholars kid, as they call it at state, that my tuition or scholarship paid for my dorm as well as school. And so, yeah, that's a pretty big, uh-oh, what am I going to do now moment.
Yeah. And okay, so I read your articles online, and of course your memoir. And so can you take the audience through what happens next?
Sure. And so a friend of mine who was sort of my college TA and her husband, I said, what am I going to do sort of thing. And they knew I need money. And he had been a bouncer at strip clubs. And so they took me out to go drinking one night because that's what you do in college when your life is falling apart. And it turned out it was to a topless gentlemen's club that was having an amateur contest. And so I'd never really been exposed to that world or thought about it, but I was a dancer as a kid. My mother was European, so we didn't really have traditional norms around, nakedness and stuff, right? I can remember being at topless beaches in France when I was a child, thinking it was normal. And so I became a dancer to raise money, right, to pay for school. But ultimately, my personality type is I don't really do anything small. So I didn't just dance at a local strip club as a house dancer. I actually found a woman who was North America's most published centerfold at the time, befriended her. She became my mentor, and I had actually thought I found my calling. So I went on the road and started touring the adult circuit. I dropped out of school, and then over the next year and a half or so, built a $250,000 a year business as an adult entertainer.
And you're like 18 or 19 when this is happening?
Yeah, 18, 19 years old. Yeah. And
Incredible.
people think that world is all about, um, the skin trade, right? It's all sex appeal and fantasy. And what was really interesting was this woman that I met at that time. She'd built a business with multiple revenue streams. She went on the radio. She taught me how to build a fan club. She taught me how to do contests so that I could then be paid to come in as the headliner, right? If you've ever, seen advertisements, sometimes they put somebody up on the billboard and say this famous person is kind of coming in. So through her teachings and understanding that industry, I basically built a brand as a famous headliner, even though I didn't really have any adult credits, right? We sort of did lots of pictures and made it look like I was famous. And then one day we ordered a magazine called the Adult Exotic Dancer Guide or something like that. And I literally cold called every big club in the country and mailed them packets with, pictures and keychains and mouse pads to make it look like I was famous. And then just started booking, and they started booking me as their headliner. And of course, built a fan club and did all the things.
I picture the people who eventually your story obviously leads to sales, and I picture people competing against you, being like, "Oh, do I really want to deal with cold calling?" And you're like, I think I'm past that. Like we've gone a step further here.
Well, it's
Okay,
wild how the skills are transferable. And I was just a kid trying to figure it out, right?
yeah, it's amazing. I was watching one of the talks you gave, and you had a lesson where it said if you want to build customer relationships, you have to talk to people, and you had a very like kind of clear application. Can you take me through the story that led to that saying?
Sure. So if you can kind of imagine at 18 years old, not a lot of self-confidence. I was actually a tomboy, believe it or not. I had never owned makeup, never owned a hair dryer. Um, you know, Probably wore like basketball shorts and, socks and Tevas and an oversized basketball t-shirt. Like that was sort of my look. Going into this world where, women were very feminine and they wore makeup and were very confident. And the irony of irony is strip clubs and learning how to talk to customers. It was sort of this petri dish that enabled me to get in touch with my own voice and strengthen it in a way that I'd never done outside of my journals. Right. And so what was really interesting is I would have thought that, making money in the adult world was all about who's the prettiest or who has the most perfect physique, when the reality was most nights as I learned that industry and I learned how to talk to people and got comfortable in my own skin, physically and metaphysically, I made more money than the average person simply by talking to people, right? And it was that lesson that taught me how to not only connect with people, but realize how deep those human drivers that we all have are to be seen, to be heard, to be acknowledged, to be accepted, maybe even to be loved. And so it was there that I strengthened that aperture, right, or muscle memory for myself. And I really believe it's that skill set that once I got out of the world of adult entertainment into a more traditional business career, why sales just made sense, because I was comfortable going into a room and talking to absolutely anybody, but doing so in a way that that person walks away feeling touched, moved, inspired, heard, right? There's that quote by Maya Angelou that I love, and I'll paraphrase it because I won't get exactly right, but she says, people will forget what you've said. They'll often forget what you do, but they will never forget how you make them feel. And I think the conduit to making and feeling in somebody else is a combination of the presence that you are, the space that you hold for them, and then the language that you use when you're speaking with them. We often think in sales it's about talking, but what is that cliche that you have one mouth and two ears? So how do you learn to really deeply, truly listen so somebody feels heard? that's all within that realm of that, talk that you're talking about, where I say learning how to really talk to people and doing so in a way where you excavate a meaning and an understanding of what they're saying, but also of what they're not saying. Their lips might say one thing, but if their body language says something else, and you can connect with them sort of on a neural level, either at the brain or on a physical level through the space that you make, and they experience an energetic shift in how they feel, that's really powerful.
I think that's so well said. When I started in sales, I thought I was supposed to be talking and kind of learning how to talk. And I forgot some basics about just kind of treating people the way you wanted to be treated. Not that I was being rude or something, but just approaching people with the way that they are human. And when I was listening to your talk, I was like, oh, this reminds me of trade shows. And like when I used to go to
Mm,
trade shows, I didn't know what to do. I still kind of don't know what to do. I'm super introverted, but just going up to people and kind of acknowledging who they are. I thought your lesson was like really applicable there. I would imagine you don't have issue at trade shows anymore.
no, I actually quite enjoy them, right? But for different reasons. It's that connection, getting to see people in real life and build those bonds.
Absolutely. Now, you also had one other lesson that I thought was really smart from your time, and it was just the focus on creating regulars, another kind
Mm.
of practical experiential thing. Can you talk about how you landed on that?
Sure. I didn't always have the right language for it back in the day, but working in North Carolina at a club that was, a little bit further out in the sticks or the boonies, it didn't have a regular flow of customers like some of the other clubs that were closer to town. So it became really clear very quickly on a slow night, if you were going to make any money, you needed regular customers that were coming in specifically to see you, right? The slang is regulars, and it's not a slang that's only in the adult entertainment world. Ask a bartender, ask a server, even valet parking attendants. They'll get their regulars that come in, they build a relationship, they kind of tip them on a regular basis. Well, in the adult entertainment world, you're often going in and paying to work there. Right? You might have $100 house fee. You have to tip the bartender. You have mandatory tip out to the DJs, to the house mom or dad. So you might be $200 to $300 upside down. So if you don't get enough customers coming in to tip you, you're not actually going to make any money that night. And so pretty quickly you learn that to develop those bonds and relationships with people so that they come back to see you over and over and over again. And it's wild because when I eventually published my story and it was no longer a secret, 20 odd years later after I left that world, I had regular customers from back in the day pop up on my feed or and send me messages. And they said, we always knew you were going to publish a book one day. And that gets to the humanity in people, right? That those connections and those relationships, if you honor people and build a foundation of trust and add value to people, like you'll have people who will take your calls or stay in touch or follow you for your entire lifetime. And I think that's really, really powerful and special.
That's super powerful. And I'm going to fast forward here a bit, and I'm going to enter what I call your deal maker phase. Forgive me, that's what my research led me to call this phase. But you eventually returned to college,
Yeah.
and finish your studies, and then try to transition kind of out into the working corporate world. You did so during the difficult economic period. Can you take me through sort of that time in your life and say, okay, now I'm jumping out of college and into a different world? What was that experience like for you?
Sure. So to sort of connect the dots, right? I knew adult entertainment was a dead end track, and I gave myself some very finite parameters about getting out. Right. And when I did that, I went back to college. I got my 2-year degree, then a 4-year degree. And in that interim of going to school, had spent 6 years at a tech startup. And that startup was about to go public. I mean, we were getting quiet notices from the investment banking firm. We had the ticker picked out, but this was 2007, right before the Great Recession hit. And so my transition back out of college now into a full-time job was probably one of the worst economic times we've seen, sort of pre-COVID. And so I actually moved back to Las Vegas and took a job as a financial analyst at the Luxor. I had aspirations of Wall Street, like dollar signs in my eyes. And all the people I interviewed with said, you've got a 3.97 from UMass. That's great. But I got 4 O's from Harvard who are legacy hire. Can't take a chance on you. One gentleman said, but you have casino gaming experience from that startup you worked at. If you go to Las Vegas, get a financial analyst position, they'll put you in the basement. They'll teach you SQL to query all the systems, but you'll learn how to build models. I can bring you in as a lateral hire in a year or so. Let's stay in touch. And so that was my plan. But nobody really expected, unemployment to surge past 30% in Las Vegas. Right. And we all know when companies are going through those kind of times, typically the last person in is often the first person out. Over the next 3 years, I was laid off 4 times. Each time I got a new job, I'd be there for a few months. There'd be an org chart change, org restructure, and my role would be removed from the org chart. And I think for a lot of people that would be really hard. But I think because I was already scrappy and had learned how to sort of pick myself up and transition my life, it was actually a really exciting time because each time I got laid off, I was like, okay, well, what's the seed of opportunity that's within this. And I took sort of a salesperson's perspective. Now I would say that then I didn't know it, but I just made a list of, okay, well, what are my skills? Where's that marketable? What are the companies? How can I call them? So that same methodology that I used to land gigs as a headliner was the same process I applied to getting a job. And what ended up happening is each one of those job transitions, I went to a bigger job at a bigger company, right, which comes with a bigger compensation package. And over those 3 years, ultimately landed in the IT services or outsourcing industry. I think at that time I was 32 years old, which is a little bit of a late starter by traditional standards in outsourcing. And I remember just feeling so far behind, like my first AE job and I'm 32 and people are making director and they're getting married and all of the things. But what was so interesting was all of that transition and change had built this foundation of skills that was really well suited to the company I worked for and to an industry that is known for being really difficult. That ultimately, when I applied that, I'd sort of found a place where I could find a pace, and my career has taken off exponentially ever since in the last 15 years.
Yeah, I loved that part of the story because you probably feel like you're behind, but in reality, those life experiences have set you forward with such practical experience that you never could have known. So talk to me about
Absolutely.
that time when you are getting your footing, and it starts to click. You go, oh wow, okay, I am good at this. The good things kind of start happening and it becomes your immediate future.
And it's a really interesting question because that realization for me, I think, is much more recent in my life than maybe it would seem, right? Getting into managed services, outsourcing, and learning how to do deals. I think my first year in, the quota was like $1 million. I did pretty well. The following year is 10 million. The following year is 25 million ultimately, right? And so it went up exponentially until I was leading a team that did $4.2 billion in new local business, which sounds amazing. And based on your question, would make me think there's a lot of ahas in there. But I was still so focused on myself until I became a coach and a leader. It was never good enough. I always wanted more. Well, yes, I did the biggest deals in the company last year, but I only did two. Could I do three? Like I hadn't actually metabolized my past and my history to realize like, wow, look in the rear mirror, look at how far I've come. I was still living from this place, not of scarcity, but my dreams are so big that I felt like I had so much work to do on myself that I actually really was giving my power away and hadn't owned like or taken the claim in the level of my success. I don't really think that started to hit me until longer in my leadership journey when I was coaching and training and managing larger and larger teams and realizing, wow, like so many of the building blocks of lessons that I got in non-traditional ways that helped me apply them to a sales career that have made me extremely successful are gaps in other people's foundation, right? And that's not good, bad. There's no finger pointing there. It's for whatever reason, I had this incredible base to choose from, which enabled me to operate at an extremely high level, whether it's in selling or in deal making or in business. But I hadn't seen it, right? Because I hadn't been exposed to enough other ways to do things. And so it's really only been in the last few years that I sort of looked around and went, wow, actually, this is not just a skill, this is a gift. Right. And I've been gifted to have mentors and lessons in life that have shaped me into who I am. And so who I am as a leader believes in sort of paying that back to other people to sort of help others accelerate their own individual success, whatever that means for that individual person.
Oh, that's interesting. So you kind of didn't see those as aha moments when they were happening. You were fed into, the quota doesn't get smaller. It's gonna 10x. You see that as something that you should have kind of known internally as like, I am having this success. I am having these aha moments, whether that's like a personal thing or whether you think that that's related to like the culture of sales, market
That's a great
quotas.
question.
Can you talk through that for me?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point that you bring up. And I think it's a combination of both. I think when you're in a hard charging sales culture and your number increases every year, there are always people basically throwing up on what you've done or kicking you in the teeth and telling you it's not good enough. And I think you have to get to a point where you're no longer looking for external validation and you are, right, taking the time to truly see yourself and you develop those muscles for yourself and you drown out that noise that you actually start to own your power. I mean, one of the most common phrases I heard in my career was, you don't know how powerful you are. And when you own that, like, look out. And I used to listen to that and think, well, what does that mean? Oh, my number went to 400 million, but I got 380. I didn't hit it, right? Like I was still so caught up in the metrics or the noise that I couldn't see it. You asked about an aha moment. One of the biggest aha moments that I've had in my entire career happened only a few months ago. I had the opportunity and privilege to be part of a company that was being taken to market for sale. And why that's really interesting is growing up as a kid outside of New York City, I've been around high finance, private equity, investment banking my whole life, right? Those were the kids who had cars for graduation and money and went to Harvard and all the things. And I'd already been told no from that world so many times, that that was not a place designed for somebody with my background, my skills, my lack of pedigree by those traditional finance standards. And ironically, many of those folks were my customers, as loyal customers, as adult entertainers. When I transitioned to a startup and our customers or casino customers, many of those folks who worked in high finance were my customers again. It was never going to be a world for me. But fast forward, learning to become a deal maker and do $100 million, $500 million transactions at the highest level in IT outsourcing or managed services. And I was interacting with private equity firms and board level folks for several years, but it was always in the name of a deal, right? It was always with the company logo all over the slide. So it hadn't really dawned on me that there was a me piece in it, if that makes sense. And fast forward to being in a room with an investment banking firm, private equity, the board of the company that's wanting to sell, and just watching a dynamic unfold where there was a call for leadership. There was a call for a perspective that only I had. So to step into that conversation and not just have it be well received, but to actually run a 4-hour meeting with all of these people, not just as a peer, but as a thought leader, filling in gaps that others were not able to see. I remember walking out of that meeting, which was actually was almost a year ago, and going, wow, that's what people meant by that power, right? An acute ability to look at market data, a company's technology stack, service offerings, whatever you want to call them, what's going on in the enterprise or mid-market or even SMB space, triangulating all of this data to come up with a value proposition to actually sell a company when I've never done that before and I've never worked at a private equity firm. Like that's a really unique skill set that has come from being in the trenches of selling and doing deals that are bigger and understanding the stakeholders that I now see is really rare and unique. And I will hold on to that day for the rest of my life as maybe a turning point in my own growth or recognition of who I am and what I contribute.
I love that story. So you continue on as kind of a deal maker, individual contributor, massive deals.
Yeah.
And I saw that you were going through an acquisition, and at the same time, you had just bought your dream house. And I'm wondering if you can tell me the story of what happened next.
Sure. So, the company I worked for was acquired. And what I did not know at the time is they allow the company they've acquired to operate as normal for about 12 months. And then on month 13, they adopt you into their operating models, their compensation plans, to all of that. I had just gone all in on a dream home that I'd been sort of fantasizing about since childhood, punched above my weight class. But 5 years into this aspect of my career in this company, I felt safe to do that, right? There were big deals coming. There was a trajectory of financial growth, and I went all in. And less than 30 days later, we got called down to Dallas. All of the French executives were coming into town to meet us. And then it turned out that, they were basically changing the compensation plans from, a base plus commission to a max bonus of 25% of your base. Now, I'd been historically earning 200 to 300% of my base in commission. So overnight, that money was gone, which meant, and Trump came into office and the tax brackets changed. And suddenly my net take home was not enough to pay this new mortgage. And so it sent, and I was married at the time and my partner was not working, getting her master's full time. So it was on my shoulders and I was, mid to late 30s, cash flow upside down for the very first time in my life, well, since being young, right? And so talk about somebody who's always prepared and has the spreadsheets and budgets and a situation I never thought that I would be in. And of course, the company promised, oh, you're top performer, we'll fix it, we'll do all the things. All of those promises took 3 years to come into fruition. And so, I had to get really scrappy while maintaining my job. And could I have gone somewhere else? Sure. But with all the promises about what they were going to fix it, and an industry that's known for being so difficult with an 85% attrition rate, I really didn't want to go somewhere else and starting over. I wanted them to fix it, but to survive and pay my bills. I had just finished coaching school, but I had zero intentions of becoming a coach and selling services. I went through that year-long coaching program for the leadership development aspect of it. And I actually called my coach because I had a coach at the time. I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. Like I've got, 6 months of runway, but I'm negative every month. Like I can't survive on this. And he said, well, why don't you're in sales. Now you have a coaching certification, just get some clients. And you would think for a career seller that would be easy, but I had been helping people for free for so long. I had this huge block around what would anybody pay me for? Like, how would I even package that up? What would that look like? But I actually had to do that to survive. And it was, in the beginning, I think I charged people $25 to redo their resume, right? And eventually I was doing executive resumes for a couple grand. And so it forced me to figure out what skills and gifts that I have, packages them in services for other people, and then actually sell them while doing my day job, right? So weekends, nights, planes, whatever it was, I was rewriting resumes, coaching people, writing articles, like anything that I could do, right? Until that situation with my career and my job and cash flow got resolved. But in hindsight, my income had gone up exponentially prior to that. I probably got a bit big for my britches buying $1 million house, right? And that my base could not carry. And so, I was humbled by the universe. Oh, and by the way, this custom dream home that was 30 years old had all sorts of things wrong with it that we didn't find in inspection. And suddenly I didn't have the financial means to fix it. So over the next 3 years, like I learned how to become a handyman. I tarred the roof and drained the gutters and replaced the garbage disposal and fixed all the irrigation. So I'm actually now pretty handy. And yeah, I mean, I really think even at the time, I remember saying, okay, I got too big for my britches. The universe is humbling me, like just bunker down and get through it. But I wouldn't wish that on anybody, but to come out the other side and say, okay, I'm in corporate America because I choose to be, but there will be a day that I take the skills that I learned in that phase of my life, right? And do all of those things at scale. And that's a gift.
Absolutely. Now, you're clearly a very successful salesperson. You mentioned wanting to get into leadership and taking some tactical steps to do that. And then you obviously did get into leadership. And I'm curious, what was the biggest learning curve the first time you actually were in the trenches managing people?
It comes from a couple of different angles. In full transparency, I'd been offered many leadership positions to go from deal maker to sales leader, whatever it was. And I always said no because I had fear and blocks around what that meant. I knew myself, didn't follow all the rules of admin stuff you're supposed to do, updating your Salesforce expenses on time. So to me, managing a team of people like me would be a nightmare. And so I was not going to do it. And this is a conversation that went on at that company for years. And one day the CEO said, like, what is this aversion to leading a team? And at that point, there'd been no chief sales officer. I had been getting multiple teams together every week, reviewing the pipeline, doing all of the management things, but didn't think of it that way, right? Because it was a team of, let's call it rock stars, 18 players that didn't all, it was just a very different dynamic. And so the hardest part for me was seeing myself in that way and realizing that I could lead in the way I want to. I think probably had some scar tissue because so many of the bosses or people managers that I had were not very good. Right? Like if there's a toxic form of leadership, I've experienced it, which was fine because I am self-sufficient and I could survive. But I think I had this aversion to managing a team because I knew what leadership shouldn't look like. And I was still strengthening my ability to lead in a way that felt true to myself, but had not yet met anybody who mirrored all of the leadership qualities that I was aspiring to grow into. So the biggest block was that in the beginning. But then ultimately, that CEO was very smart. And he said, well, you don't need to lead the team, but just look after them for a little while and help them and help me find more Jaime Konzelmans. And so I was like, okay, well, that's fine. And it was this backdoor into using the coaching and training skills that I had been trained in and acquired outside of the, job. That was my first foray into leading bigger and bigger teams. And I would say then to get really clear for the part of your questions of what was the hardest part when I actually started to do that. I think it's an adjustment when you go to different companies, different cultures. And I think the biggest, most painful lesson for me to learn was how to discern between whether it's one of your leaders or one of your sellers, how to discern when somebody has a skill gap versus a will gap, right? A lot of people can say when a new leader comes in and they're on a growth journey of, okay, you've been selling this way, a product or tactical way. Now we need you to learn how to sell a solution. And that's a consultative sales journey that may take 3, 5, 7 years or whatever the case may be. The reaction often is for people who do get afraid, right? To dig in on what they used to know, maybe to tear you down in the process because they don't want to change. But there's a lot of layers to that. I tend to take people at their word. So I had to manage a lot of people who were saying all the right things, but were actually never committed to doing the change. They were more committed to proving that I was not a good manager or that the company didn't need to change because they were petrified of the change, right? And so that lesson, and worse, right? Sort of organizing ways behind the scenes to try to out me, right? Like the political stuff that I just don't have a good stomach or aptitude for. And so I think that was really painful. But in hindsight, when I look back at that, I had some growing up to do, right? I needed to start to learn how to apply the same listening, communication, relationship skills to evaluating whether or not somebody was being truthful in their efforts, whether or not they really didn't understand or they were playing games because they didn't want to grow. I think that was a hard lesson and hard time period for me.
That makes sense. You have a great quote from one of your blogs that I liked where you said, leadership doesn't have to be a performance. What do you mean by that?
There's a lot to that. I think there's a pitfall in corporate America, especially in sales. The numbers matter. Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of leaders who come up the ranks modeling traditional male values and traditional metrics driven values that somewhere along the way we've lost the lens of humanity and connection to each other that I think is paramount to leadership, right? It's so easy to look at a spreadsheet and say, well, let's rank and stack the sellers and this one's performing and this one's not, and let's get everybody below the line. But if you actually don't know what's going on with each individual seller, if you don't know what territories they have, if you don't know, if you're comparing, right, somebody fresh out of grad school who's just earned a master's in technology sales versus somebody internally, maybe who doesn't have a degree and is a single parent, it's not the same. You can't look through the same lens. You have to understand everything situation specific. And if you're so focused on performance at the cost of everything else, you'll miss those human elements. And it's really the diversity and the humanity that when you can cultivate the right environment for people to be their best from wherever they're at, to me, that's what lights entire teams and organizations up.
I love that. Respect the art, but don't make it performance art. I love it.
Yeah, there's a balance. There's science and there's art,
Absolutely.
and you need both.
Absolutely. Okay. Quick time check. All right. I want to ask you, when did you know it was time to write a book? That must have
Mm.
been um, an incredible process. Obviously, your book is also, it's not just a how-to for professional development. There is some very vulnerable stories that are in there. And so I would love to hear the story of when it became time to write the book and what that process was like for you.
Sure. Oh, I'm a writer, right? Before I had great communication skills to even speak to other people, I kept journals. Like when I was 4 or 5 years old, like I've kept journals my entire life. And so I always knew intuitively I would write a book or many books. I think it was actually right before I got into, IT services and industry. Like when I'd been laid off the fourth time, I said, I'm going to take 6 months off and I'm going to pursue my passions. And I made a list. And it was all the things in life I'd always wanted to do, but never had done. Be an athlete, write a book, learn more languages. There's 8 things on this list. And so what was interesting is when I sat down, like I just wrote. I think the first time I wrote a manuscript, it was over 300,000 words. And then I Googled how long should a nonfiction manuscript be? And it turns out it's 80 to 90,000 words. And I was like, oh, I guess I wrote too much. There must be a lot of garbage in there. And so the writing part for me is innate, intuitive. It's like breathing for me. It was the publishing journey and getting to a point that I was comfortable enough in myself to walk through the doors and share the story. Well, that took 10 years from the time I actually started writing the first manuscript. I wrote 3 manuscripts, hadn't published any, knew I needed to walk through those doors. And coincidentally, not coincidentally, this was leading into COVID. It was also, I was sort of attached to, I hadn't had that vice president title yet. I was leading a team, hadn't gotten the title. And I was deathly afraid that and believed to my core publishing my story would ruin my business career and all the success that I had built. And so I had to get to a point where I was willing to walk through those doors and say, you know what, if it does, then my what's next will be built from those ashes. And so that was the piece that I had to go through. And the irony of ironies, as life is, it does, the closer I got to publishing once I was committed to doing it was when I started to get promotions and I got the title and then my team got bigger and it was kind of wild because that was a secret about being an adult entertainer. I hadn't really told a soul in 20 years. And yet the first people in the business world I started telling were the inside sales teams and the BDRs because look, outsourcing in IT is hard. They were struggling, right? New first corporate job, 200,000 people in the company, an attrition rate of 85%, a culture that was built on predominantly German, French, Indian values of business. So very, very different. A lot of these new college starters were first generation Americans in their first business job. And so really they gave me a safe space to say, look, this is who I am. And if I can go from adult entertainer to deal maker to now your leader, there's no possible way you can't succeed in this business. But let me take you on the journey. And I've never trained people. I'm a new coach. But if I take all the things that were hard for me and I put them into little lessons, would you go on this journey with me and take those tools and put them in your toolbox and see if it would help? And so we went on that journey together over the course of a couple of weeks in Dallas. I just literally took the wife, took the dogs, drove to Dallas and just started making PowerPoints to help this group. And I was not even officially their leader, right? Like their leader was gone. And what was amazing was when we went through that, and the more I shared my story, the more I just showed up as myself. And that whole team did phenomenal. It was a few months later, our CEO and chief HR officer pulled me into a meeting on Teams, and I thought I was getting fired because they opened with, "What are you telling the BDRs? What are all these stories we're hearing?" And I thought, "Oh my God, well here it goes, right? Like try not to cry, your career's over." And what was ironic was he said, "Well, whatever you're doing, it's working. I don't know if you've looked at the rest of the numbers, but your 16 BDRs have qualified more pipeline than the 300 sellers we have in the rest of North America. Congratulations, you're the head of the team. We want to give you budget to get that group up to 45 people, and we're giving you all the senior business developers. What do you need to say yes? And I was like, I need an admin, I need a sales ops person, I need to dedicate, like a deal, I need all the resources to support me, and we will do this. And what was interesting is that company was known for being very slow at things. They made all of that happen within the next 2 business days.
Wow.
It was wild.
That's a fantastic story. You mentioned a list, athletics and kind of a bucket list. Are you still tackling items on that list? I'm curious.
Most of them at this point have been realized, except for the getting fluent in a couple multiple languages. The athlete one was, I'll share that story because at that point, I'll admit when I made this list, it was over a few glasses of champagne and some soul searching. When I looked at it the next day, I thought, be an athlete, how on earth? I wanted to play sports as a kid. My family didn't necessarily believe in it. My, working class family. My parents thought it was too expensive. They didn't want to give up their weekends. They thought buying the cleats and the things was a scam to make money. And I was kind of a chunky kid, so I wasn't real coordinated anyway. And so when I looked at that list at 32, and I thought, God, if being an athlete is still in my heart, I have to do something about that, right? And so I ended up joining a run club, hoping to at this point in my life, I was fit. I went to the gym regularly, but I'd never done a sport. That writing down that goal or dream or bucket list item, whatever you want to call it, led to me joining a run club. And when I went and said, hey, I want to learn how to run a 5K, the woman's like, well, I'm an endurance athlete who does Ironman. I train people for half marathons. I believe there's an athlete living inside everyone. I will be in your life as little or as much as you want. And over the course of the next 6 months, of course, I did a 5K and then a half marathon and then a sprint triathlon. And within 13 months, did my first half Ironman. Fast forward 15 years later, I've now done 13 half Ironmans, 3 fulls, and now I'm training for my first Deca Mile in a couple of weeks.
Wow.
So it's a physical transformation that gave me a roadmap that said there is nothing more powerful than looking deep within your heart for your deepest desires and learning how to lean in that and bring it to life. And it was crossing the Ironman finish line that made me say, I want to find my life purpose. And it's going to be a combination of my passion, my gifts, and being of service to other people. Now, I thought that would go as quickly as Ironman training. Again, that was probably another 10 years in the making to find life coaching and then apply coaching to executive coaching and then apply that to leadership within corporate America. But these are the breadcrumbs that really got me to where I am, that if I could gift to other people, I would do it in a heartbeat. Like, own your story, find your gifts, do what makes you happy because life is too short.
I had a very similar experience with Ironman, and it kind of propelling me forward in a number of areas in my life, just giving me confidence and answering some questions about myself. And so I'd love to hear that. All right. So you have done a lot. You're multifaceted, more so than most sales executives that we talk to. What is something that you're most curious about right now?
I think one of my biggest personal curiosities right now is around how powerful our minds are. Right. And when I say that, meaning like so often we live in a stressful environment and we think it's work stress, but I'm starting to waken up to and learn more about how the personal stressors in our life can be stored in our body. Right. There's a school of thought that says trauma is even stored in our bodies at a cellular level. Right. And so maybe those sore throats or maybe that cold that you get is actually fear that's stuck in your chest. And what are the somatic tools, the breath work, the mantras? Like, how can you almost rewire the neurological pathways in your brain out of fear-based patterns or things that your body is holding on to that it just needs to release to find a deeper level of vitality in your life, whether that's physically, emotionally, spiritually. And I think there's a lot more to that. And then I know there's a lot more than I would have ever thought. I've long loved the book by Louise Hay, Heal Your Mind, Heal Your Body, where you can look up any physical ailment and she gives you what could be a root cause. And I'll be darned if almost every time it doesn't hit the nail on the head.
That's interesting.
And so that's what I want to learn more about is how can I continue finding these tools and models and the research that may seem esoteric, but I think is more relevant today than ever. If you think about what the world has lived through with COVID, that's a massive trauma, whether you got physically ill or not, whether you had family members who were physically ill or not. Like, we were shut down. Children went through developmental periods of their life in a very different way where everything was electronic. And I think we're still coming out of that. The rate at which technology has proliferated and disrupted almost every business industry on the planet since then is completely unprecedented. I think we're being called to, as sellers, as leaders, show up in ways that are more authentic, that are more connected, that tap into our humanity in a way that not too long ago would have been seen too woo or too feminine or too whatever you want to call it. because I know and have experienced when I have the courage to be most vulnerable and authentic me, people gravitate towards that. And I think there's an incredible amount of healing that can happen through that connection. I just don't think we're living in a time where we don't need more spreadsheets and models. We need more connection and health and happiness. And I think there's a lot of power in that. So I want to continue to lean into that curiosity. And as always, anything I learn, then be a conduit of knowledge and tools for other people.
I love that. Okay. Now, my last question is: you have some exciting news. We're recording this as you're
Yes.
taking on a new challenge. Can you tell us about what's led you to the new challenge?
Yeah, so I'm really excited. I haven't actually officially made this announcement anywhere, so this is hot off the presses, but I am starting a brand new role in the coming weeks. So I've taken a new job. I will be leading up sales at an IT services company called Rapid Scale, which is owned by Cox Business Services. And why this is really as exciting is I have the gift of working for a longtime mentor and friend and a woman who is currently the CRO, Maureen Power Sweeney. She has had the biggest impact on my professional development, probably in my life, but on a human level that helped me get back to me, right? I mentioned earlier in the interview, part of my breakthrough that I had to get through was learning to lead in a leadership style and a values that I had never met. When I met this woman 4 or 5 years ago, she modeled the type of leadership style and acumen that I was trying to grow into that I've never seen. And there's an expression that says you can't be what you can't see. And I never liked that expression, probably because I was always in a room of people who never looked like me. So I didn't want to think that there was validity in it. But when you meet a leader who models the type of leadership style that you want to aspire into, and that person puts their hand out and makes space for you, I mean, that's incredibly powerful. I mean, I went from being a deal maker to a vice president to being a CRO in 3 years. And there's no way that would have happened had I not had the support and mentorship of love of this woman. And so to get to support her in driving and the other leaders at this company for driving for Cox, right, one of the largest family owned businesses in America, the next phase of 5x growth to bring this company to $1 billion. I mean, it's just fun. It's just fun. And I've met so many people there who also have very similar sort of family kindness values. And I think I'm at a point in my life where that's everything, right? There's titles and there's money and there's the job. But at the end of the day, when you find people that you can connect with who feed you instead of depleting you, well, then there's nothing that you can't do. So I could not be more thrilled to be joining the Rapid Scale team, and I can't wait to see what we do together.
Jamie, that's an incredible note to end on. We're all going to be watching and we'll be eager to see things happen for you. And we really appreciate you sitting with us and telling us your story and would love to stay in touch.
Awesome. I would love that. Thank you. And if you are a seller or a sales leader who wants to learn more about Rapid Scale, I am rapidly scaling my team. So would love to hear from you.